All right, I'm working on it. All right. And without further ado, Dr. Donna Richards, thank you.
Okay, I've worked out some things that I want to share with you, and I want your patience, and I hope your interest. It's a topic which I don't think is treated seriously enough, and with system and with method, and that's what I'm attempting to do this evening. But it's going to take energy on my part and on your part. I think it'll be worth it. Pardon me? Do I have to? African spiritual thought in its own terms. Okay, many of us are practicing other religions because we need something. That's a human need. That's an African need. And we're doing this because no one has ever presented African religion to us in terms of the underlying philosophy that the religion is based on. That is, no coherent statement has been made to us about African religion, and it hasn't been explained in terms of the African worldview. Usually it's explained with reference to somebody else's worldview. So I want to attempt to correct that this evening, and then we can get hopefully into questions. But I want to lead slowly into it, because I think first we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by terms that we use all the time, but there may be some confusion about them. I like to make a distinction sometimes between religion and spirituality, because I think that these two terms can be used in different ways. When we define religion in an Afrocentric context, we are talking about a spiritual philosophy which permeates or fills our entire existence, our entire personal and cultural existence. It's a spiritual ideology, a spiritual philosophy. Now, by spirituality, in an African context, we're talking about the place of the sacred in African life. By religion, unfortunately, usually in a European context, we are emphasizing an institution, emphasizing documentation, dogma, whatever, but it's separated from other aspects of our lives. Okay, that tends to be the way in which we use religion ordinarily when we speak in a Western context, but that's not going to be the meaning that we're going to be using tonight. Now what I want to do is to ask and answer another question, and that is, well, why do you need a spiritual philosophy? Why do you need a religion? All peoples have always created spiritual concepts. Why? And I want to answer it in terms of what it is that a spiritual philosophy should do for us. First of all, it presents to us our values as imperatives. That is, it says to us that we don't have a choice but to act in a certain way. It's not like we're choosing to do that, but something is saying, you have to do that. That's the way you have to be. That's the way you have to act, because that's the right way to do it. And that's what your spiritual philosophy or your religion does for you. It also, at the same time, a part of that is that it sanctions the culture. Therefore, your spiritual philosophy is particular and not universal. Now, I know this may sound strange and be an unpopular position, but I think it's accurate. That is, that my goddesses, gods, spirits, orisha, energies, forces, beliefs, speak to me in a very special way. That is, they say something about my special experience. And me, in this context, is we. It is the collective. Why? Because we are African. And that is what me means when we are African. Very important to keep in mind. Secondly, our spiritual thought, or religious practice, if you will, must put our behavior, our actions, in tune with what we perceive to be a deeper, higher, ultimate truth. Okay? In tune with an eternal reality, what we perceive to be an eternal reality. On the other hand, we always have the circle. It always comes back the other way. Our spiritual conceptions should be able to bring divine truth closer to us. That is, it should be able to bring divine truth onto the plane of human existence and human reality. Another thing that happens through a spiritual philosophy is that it gives us a spiritual awareness, a sense of order that we use to defeat the chaos that we experience around us. Confusion, crisis. We know there are many times in our lives where we experience crisis. Death of somebody close to us. What we perceive to be as failure can bring crisis into our lives. Financial crisis, or the loss of a friendship. You can think of other examples. But these are times when we lose our way because everything seems to be going wrong. We don't have the answers anymore. Okay? It's difficult for us to determine which is the right way to go. What's the correct thing to do? We lose our way. What our spiritual ideology does for us, or should do for us, is that it should provide a systematic way of thinking, which in the first place acts to prevent this breakdown that we experience. But then if we do experience a breakdown or a crisis, it enables us to regain vision, to reestablish a feeling of hope and clarity and direction. It also should relieve suffering for us. This is why we need spiritual conceptions. And we all are going to have suffering, some time of suffering in our lives. It should help to make that suffering bearable. Another thing that our religious or our spiritual philosophy should do is that it should provide us with a system of symbols. And those symbols become powerful symbols because they create in us feelings which have such energy that it can motivate us to do special things. That is, they become a basis for commitment. And that commitment leads to fulfillment, to a sense of fulfillment. So that our sacred symbols, presented to us by our spiritual philosophy or ideology, presents our culture, our history, our values, our beliefs, and our identity to us in a very special way. And the way in which all of this is presented to us causes us to love them, to honor them, and to revere them. The things that I'm mentioning now, I'd like you to keep in mind so that as we talk specifically about Ancestor Communion, we can go back and see, well, how do they relate to these things? Which religion, if you want to call it that, or spiritual philosophy should do. Another thing that it should do is that it should allow us to achieve continuity of meaning. That is, by transcending, that is, moving beyond the finite moral existence that we experience as human beings, we are able to be put in touch with, let's say, the eternal aspect of the universe, or the eternal aspect of ourselves. And that's the same thing. The eternal aspect of the universe and the eternal aspect of ourselves, they are one. And I'll explain that later. Well, I wanted to give some examples from specific African philosophies. I think I might try to hold off on that, because if I do that, it's going to take me too long. But we can do it later. Now, another thing that a spiritual philosophy should do, and that is that the goals that it presents should not be separate from our political goals as a people. Now, that may be a very controversial point, but for me it is absolutely essential. Now, if these goals were separate, then that could cause conflict. That is, it could lead to conflicting commitments. We're talking, after all, about commitment. We're talking about the deepest kind of commitment that human beings can feel. Okay, so that these two areas, I'm saying, should be compatible, and I'm saying more, they should be one. And I hope to show you how that can happen. Your spiritual philosophy should reaffirm your existence. Your existence. We define ourselves collectively as Africans. So the philosophy has got to reaffirm our existence and our definition as a people, as a family, as a community, and as a nation. If a religion or a spiritual philosophy does not affirm your existence as a cultural being, then it is inadequate. It is not working properly for you. If a religion contradicts your cultural identity and seeks to separate you from your culture by denying that culture, then it's not right for you. And lastly, a religion or a spiritual philosophy must build a national consciousness. That's what religion does. And we've got to understand that. Now what I want to do is to look generally at African philosophy in general. Because African philosophy itself is a spiritual philosophy. Okay, so we're looking at the African worldview, seeing some of the characteristics. How does it work? It already implies a spiritual function because it is spiritual in nature. That's number one. Okay? And as I speak, always think in terms of a circle. To understand African conceptions, always remember the circle. The circle will keep coming back. To begin with, the African worldview or African philosophy is characterized by the idea of a unified spiritual totality, a unified whole in which all being is interrelated. So it's unity and wholeness, this becomes a basic conception. And the universe is perceived as being made up of interacting forces, which, they act on each other, but it's within an unchanging whole. The universe is perceived as being made up of changing rhythms, but within one cosmic rhythmic order. Okay? One rhythm is the whole. One rhythm is the cosmos. But within that, we have rhythms and forces which work on each other and with each other. There is also the African concept of the universal life force. Only one universal life force. Quiet as it's kept, you hear about polytheism and all of these things. All African people believe in one universal life force. And I will not call that monotheism, by the way, and maybe I can talk about that later, why I won't. Now, this life force energizes all being. It animates the universe, and it connects all being. Another characteristic of the worldview. We believe in the sacredness of the cosmos. And by the way, when we use the word cosmos as opposed to using universe, really the same thing. But cosmos implies interrelationship. Okay, and that's important. That everything in the universe is related to everything else. Okay, so in one sense, it is all one, in a very important sense. Okay, so we believe in a sacred cosmos, the creation of which was a divine act. Therefore, to know the origin of the cosmos is to know divinity. To be in touch with the cosmos is to be in touch with divinity. Another characteristics. Human beings are primarily spiritual. They are physical, but the most important part of them is spiritual. Human beings have a special relationship to the universal life force. They can activate and harness this force and use this force. And we use terms like Ashe, Nyama, Nomo. These are terms which indicate the ability that we have as human beings to use the life force. This indicates the will that we have as human beings, the conscious will that we have to act on other things, other beings in the universe. Now, because we have this special relationship to the universal life force, we therefore have a special responsibility. And what happens in this view is that spirituality becomes the basis for morality. And therefore, the misuse of this power is punished. Another characteristic is that spirit and matter are joined. They are understood to be part of a continuum. They are not separated from each other. They exist in a continuum. Spirit is energy. Spirit is force. Matter is form. Matter is the manifestation of spiritual energy. Material reality expresses spiritual reality. That's what Africans believe. So that we can experience these things around us, nature, as symbols. Symbols which are communicating to us a sacred truth which transcends them. And that's why we as Africans have such a special relationship to nature and natural phenomena. because we understand it in a very special way. Another characteristic is the idea of a harmonious order, which becomes the goal. We are always seeking to restore the harmonious order. There is energy, and energy is constantly being exchanged. It is flowing. There is interaction. And what we want is that there are no interferences or blockages to prevent us from getting sources of energy. So that life is understood as the giving and receiving of energy. Another characteristic is the idea of sacred cyclical time. This is a very important African conception. For us as Africans, we not only experience ordinary lineal time, but we also can move to another level. We can move beyond that. We must move beyond that to sacred time, which then encompasses events, life, phenomena, and so our ordinary life becomes sacralized. We call this transcendence again, very important concept. It merely means the ability to be able to experience the sacred in the ordinary, okay? We can experience the sacred dimension of existence and thereby infuse ordinary, mundane experience with a sense of the special, a sense of the extraordinary. And this is what you see happening when people of African descent come together at special times. We see it all the time, but we don't, talk about what that is, what that special thing that happens between us. Time is understood as continuous. Time, in another sense, or we can speak of the timeless, the eternal. We want to get the experience of the eternal. So in this sense, past, present, and future become linked. They're no longer separate, limiting boundaries. Another aspect, which is one of the most misunderstood aspects of African spiritual thought, and that is spirit possession. Very important one. In spirit possession, the human becomes divine. That's simply what happens. And to go the other way with the circle, the divine, we can say, is expressed and then manifested in human form. That's what's happening when someone becomes possessed by the spirits. We become goddesses, gods, and spirits through transcendence. And in that process, we gain wisdom. We become manifestations of a creative force. Another aspect, and that is ritual drama. And this has to do with our most sacred ceremonies. In these sacred rituals, we create sacred time and sacred space. And that can happen right here, and I'm sure it does. When we come together, we listen to our music, or we have a poetry reading sometimes, there's something special that happens. And at that moment, we have transcended an ordinary experience. We no longer experience time the way it usually is, and the space itself is sacralized. Okay, it's African spiritual philosophy which allows that to happen. We can transcend and manifest the sacred. We can do that because of the beliefs of our ancestors. We have the ability to experience the divine in a very intense way, and also in a very immediate way. We also, at these times, join together as a spiritual community. That is, we become one human divine psyche. so to speak. Another aspect is ritual in general. That is when we make offering, which is very African. We are demonstrating the spiritual concept of reciprocity and interdependence so that there can be a maintenance of harmony, the harmonious order. Now, as Africans, we do this on a daily basis. These rituals of offering permeate our existence. They fill African life. We give offerings, we make sacrifice. Why do we do this? Because we are asking, therefore we must give. We are taking, therefore we must replenish. That's what it means when we give offerings and ritual. Another characteristic, and I'll end with this one, is the idea of a source of being, a source of life, a source of reality, the creative source. And I should put down, you see, it's not so important what term we use for this. It's been called different things in different African systems. When we use the word "ntu," we're talking about that source. When we say "Olodumare," we're talking about that source. When we say "Ngai," Nyame or Onyame. When we say Ama, and you could probably think of more, but I'm sorry. Those are some examples of, it's an idea that I'm interested in here, a concept, not so much the word. The important thing is that we as African beings must be connected to that source. We have to find ways of being connected to that source because that's the source of life for us. And much of African religious practice is concerned with finding ways to connect ourselves to the source of life, to the source of being. When there is no connection, there is no energy. And importantly, there is no meaning in life. So for us, that means death. Because again, as African people, we must have meaning in life. Okay? Now, we ourselves are also divine in principle. Okay? The divine is not separate from us. It is us. Now that's a heavy concept, but one that we need to understand and accept. When we are in touch with our true selves, we are in touch with the divine. Now, if we make mistakes, sometimes we look outside of ourselves, we will not find that we need. There is a quotation. I was looking at it today. Naim Akbar, I don't know how many of you were fortunate enough to hear him speak when he came to First World. But I was looking over my notes, and he said something, he said, and he was referring to this concept, the Kemetic concept of the Ba, which I don't have the Medu Necha symbol for. He said that what the Ba represents in concept is that the Creator is in you. You don't have to go outside looking for it. He said, we are connected to it through our consciousness. And your awareness of its power gives you access to its resources. Okay? Then he said something very important, which is that he says the white God image is one of the most dangerous conceptions that we can have. Why? Because it alienates us from ourselves. And so it's telling you that you have to look outside of yourself for God. Maybe we'll talk about that some more later. Okay? Now what I'd like to do is to get right into the concept of ancestor communion. So what I've tried to do is to lay a basis for understanding this concept. And I want to take it step by step and talk about how it works, what its significance is. As I talk, always remember the circle. What Ancestor Communion does, for one thing, is that it places the relationship between a person and her community, a person and her family, into a sacred context. That is, those realities of family, community, nation, and so forth are placed into a spiritual context. The community and the culture are perceived as being sacred in origin. Another thing that we have to understand is that meaning, human meaning, that which is valuable to us, necessarily transcends or goes beyond the visual, the literal, the material, and the ordinary. It has to. We cannot understand the depth of meaning in life for us using a materialistic worldview. Okay? And it's saying that the most meaningful reality for us is a spiritual reality. Okay? Now, that is not to be spooky. I was giving this lecture recently, and this brother said to me, you know, I never use that word spiritual because I just don't know what people could be talking about. And I thought about that later, and I said, you know, as an African, as a person of African descent, you know, that brother is saying, I've never loved anybody. You know, I've never experienced that. Because if he had, then he'd know that's a spiritual experience. And that's all I'm talking about. You see? Which cannot be limited to material reality. You can't even talk about it in the same kind of terms that you talk about ordinary reality. And I'm going to take a second to give an example, which I gave in one of my classes. When we were talking about African concepts of time, there's a line from a song which says, I love you in a space which has no place or time. I just want you to think about what is being said there. Then I had another one. Oh, yes, the other one was, time is the space between you and me. And what I do in my classes is use these are from ordinary songs that we have known, and get people to think about, well, what does that mean? What was that sister talking about when she said that? What was that brother talking about? What was he trying to express? Okay, so what we're saying is that we've got to move to another level in order to even understand these concepts. Another important idea that has to do with Ancestor Communion is that of spiritual continuity. That is essential. As an African people, the members of a community must always be in touch with each other and must always be in touch with the source. The community, therefore, is whole when they are somehow spiritually in touch with each other. That's what makes us a community. Otherwise, we're not a community. The community must be whole so that we can share spirit, so that we can indeed commune with one another. People don't look at that word, community. That's what it means, is that you commune. And commune means a joining, a spiritual joining. Another important part of the concept of Ancestor Communion is that the idea of community itself transcends ordinary time and space, and that is why you will hear people say, or you will see it written, that the African community is made up of the dead, the living, and the yet unborn. I'm sure that you have heard that. All of those words we have to put in quotes, because we're not really talking about the dead. We're not really talking about differences in being, but we will get to that. So that the living would respond to the present, in quotes, right? The dead would be the past, in quotes, and please keep it in quotes, and the yet unborn would be the future. All of that makes up the African community. That's what Ancestor Communion says. It says without any part of that, it's not whole. And it's got to be whole. The community always has to be whole, always has to be in touch. When the physical body exists no longer, spiritual life continues. That is a basic African conception and the basis of Ancestor Communion. The essence of the human being is spiritual. I want to give you two words for the physical body. And that is khat, which would be a Kemetic term, and a su, not a shu, a su, which would be the term for the physical body, just the physical body in Twi, which is, you know, the Khan and the Ashanti speak a Twi language. The physical body is only a form that we take for a limited period of time. And we're going to see how that works. Another idea, and there is an author, I want to refer to his work. Some of his work is helpful, and some of it is confused. John S. Mbidi. African Religions and Philosophies. Okay, it's been used as kind of a basic text for many years, and some of the ideas that he has in it are helpful. As I said, he has some confusion too, some serious confusion that we'll mention. Mbidi talks about the rhythm of human life, which is a nice idea. It's a very African idea, where we start, we have birth, then you grow and develop, you reach puberty, then very importantly there is an initiation, which is preparation for marriage and procreation. Then there is the maturity of the person's life. Then there is eldership. And then what happens? What happens? Okay. People are afraid to say that, right? Okay, so then there is the death. Well, is that the end? You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go back to each of those stages. In this rhythm of human life, each one of those stages is understood as both a death and a rebirth. That is, you know, the child in us symbolically dies so that we can be reborn as a beginning adult, and so forth and so on. That is what happens symbolically in all of the rites of passage, moving from one stage to the other. So then what happens to the elder? The elder dies, but is reborn as an ancestral spirit. And that is a very important time of life in the African conception. Now, at each one of these stages, we are making a transition. And periods of transition are very serious periods. The soul, the spirit is very vulnerable. You know, because you're in between. You're not quite one thing and you're not quite another. So that we have to have our rituals and our rites to make sure that there is a successful transition. And the community, all of the community must be involved in that. We don't just let somebody out there and, you know, they're a child and we say, well, go on and grow up and be an adult, and we don't do anything about it. We help them to make that transition. The funeral ritual is the same kind of thing. That's the significance of it, given the concept of Ancester Communion, is that we are helping this being to make a very important transition to another kind of stage or experience in the life of this particular person. Another very key concept is that of rebirth. In the life cycle, you are not really born at physical birth. Now listen to what I'm saying. Your entire life, up to the point at which you procreate, is a process in which you are learning to be human. The importance of the rites of passage ceremonies are that we are, in a sense, learning our culture. We are learning to be who we are supposed to be. We are learning to be who we are. There are special times in our lives, in these rites of passage, when we intensely study our culture. That's what happens, and that's why they're so important. Now you can see that this is especially important now because we live in an alien culture. So we need times in which we very seriously and intensely study our culture, learning to be who we are to be. Okay? Although we are born African, there is a sense in which we must learn to be African. We've got to keep that in mind. So that growth and development is a process through which we are making the collective unconscious conscious. The collective unconscious that we share becomes conscious through this growth and development, if it takes place the way it should take place. Okay, not automatically, but we are developing an African consciousness through our rites of passage. And that's why they are so important. And what this concept also says is that we should not procreate until we are fully matured African beings. Now, to the life cycle again. Well, let me draw a picture first. Now, it's small, but I'm very grateful to the brother who provided it. And I'm going to see if in this little space, okay, I don't know if this is exactly what I wanted, but let's say we have our children, our young children here, and I know you can't see that, so you're just going to have to hear what it is that I'm saying. Then we have adults, Then we have the elders. And we have the ancestors. And the ancestors play a very special role in terms of the social order. Okay? The social order. Then here we could put the Orisha, which are the spiritual forces that play a special role in the natural order. I have just used one term, Orisha. There are others that I could use. And then here we have the source. This is the ultimate. And this is the whole. And what happens is that somehow we're going to see this comes right back here. Okay? So that what we get is these interlocking circles, but at the same time, it's like a spiral. So it has depth and it keeps moving. Now, what happens here is that the life cycle is a process in which we become steeped more and more and more in our culture, more and more in our tradition, in our beliefs. At the same time, we are becoming more and more in tune with the universe, which means that we are becoming more and more in tune with ourselves. We are also gaining the ability to interpret the sacred symbols of our culture on a deeper level. It gets deeper and deeper. Therefore, we are understanding more meaning in the universe, or more of the meaning of human existence. We are becoming more fully integrated into this whole system. That's what life is in this conception. Self-knowledge then implies knowledge of the cosmic order, knowledge of the spiritual whole. As we move in the life cycle, which you can see in this the diagram here, we get closer to the source. At the same time, closer to the self. We don't take this development for granted. That is, the development of the human being is not taken for granted. We have to work at it cooperatively in order for it to develop the way it should. We have to work at it together. The educational system teaches mutual responsibilities, obligations, the behavior that is expected of us towards everybody else in the group, their behavior towards us. The principle which underlies this system is reciprocity. We are taught the skills that we will need for survival so that the culture can be perpetuated. All of these things are clearly delineated within this system. The kinship system of relationships provides for the total welfare of each human being, particularly, that is, there's emphasis on the immature, the young, and the elderly, and on all of us in times of special need. Yet at the same time, we're not describing a welfare state, because you're not talking about some impersonal body or group that has responsibility for others. You're talking about all of us having a responsibility to participate in order to make this whole thing work. Okay? Now, Ancestor Communion then, as a concept, is the extension of the life cycle into the spiritual realm. So that the educational system, the kinship system, the system of communalism in which we share and cooperate, these all are also understood spiritually. And what it does then is to place the community, the family, the nation, in the context of its sacred origins, or their sacred origins, and gives us a base, a spiritual foundation. When we die physically, we merely continue this journey towards the spiritual source, and thereby toward our spiritual self, or the realization of our spiritual selves, our essence. So it's just part of a continuing life cycle. To move closer to the source is to move closer to the self. There's the circle again. We're gaining more wisdom, so we're gaining more spiritual power. The physically living are dependent on the wisdom of the ancestors for their welfare. The physically living have a sacred responsibility to carry on the traditions. This belief symbolizes that a people's strength lies in their origins. A people's strength lies in their foundation. Thank you. A people's strength lies in their cultural, racial, national identity. So that this statement says, spiritual strength is a source of political strength. It says that spiritual strength gives you political consciousness. Spiritual strength comes from your commitment to the group. The philosophy of Ancestor Communion has special political significance. These beliefs act to bind the group, to hold it together, to give a sense of order, to give a sense of rootedness as a group, not as an individual. And thereby there's a difference with other spiritual philosophies, other concepts. I am sacred not because of my individual identity. I am sacred because of my communal identity. Now, also in this concept of Ancestor Communion, I'm explaining all of this because I think that some of us really want to know, well, how does it work? How can I relate to it? So I want to just break it down. We have the important concept of memory in Ancestor Communion. That's a critical African idea, faculty. And we can speak of memory on a personal level, on a collective level, and we can also talk about racial memory. Now, when a person dies physically, he or she is remembered by those who survive. Those who were closest to her will be responsible for keeping that memory alive on a personal level. That is, you talk about the person, you say what they were like, you can describe them, you may make sure you don't forget their birthday and do something special on their birthday, other kinds of rituals like that. Why do they do that? Why is it important that we do that? Because what it means to be an ancestor is that your life exemplified the values of the group. It means that in your life, you identified yourself with the group. That is very important. And that you represent the beliefs of the group, the commitments that the group holds dear. And that's why you have an honored place in the community. Technically, you would not become an ancestor if you repudiated the values of the group, if you did not identify yourself with the group. Therefore, to remember an ancestor is to strengthen the culture. When we define ancestor in this way, to remember an ancestor is to strengthen the community by reinforcing the values of the community. And as we've said, you must earn this respect. If you disrespected others, you will not be loved. And so you will not be remembered. If you didn't love others, you will not be loved. And so you will not be remembered. You are in danger of not becoming an ancestor. Now, this also says something about the elders. Might sound a little strange, but there are two different ways of using the word elder. You're not automatically an elder because you reach the age of 65. That may sound strange, but I want to make this point. Because elder can have a double meaning. Elder can mean old in terms of aged, but it also means wise in the African conception. Therefore, an elder is someone who carries herself properly, as an elder should, and is therefore respected. And it is assumed that if you go through this process the correct way, and through the rites that you have gone through and so forth and so on, that you are becoming wiser and so forth. Okay, but you don't automatically get that respect. You have to feel a certain way about the community. And it comes from your love of the community. Now, let's go back to this memory and the continuance of your life. If you have no children, then you're in danger. Because maybe there's not going to be anybody to remember you. Okay, and to perform the kinds of rituals that are necessary. So what does that mean to those of us who have no children? It means that the idea of communal parenting is essential. That every child of African descent is my child. And that I must act like that. That I must be a mother to them and not just say that, but I must be prepared to make those kind of sacrifices, and I will be remembered. And I will be an ancestor. The one thing that we do not want to do is to risk permanent spiritual death. It is not physical death which frightens us as Africans, but spiritual death, that frightens us. That is the most awful phenomenon to an African mind, to the African mind. But we must be remembered in order to be continued. That is, in order for us to live, we must be remembered. Now, the elders have the longest memory, the longest lifespan. They have the responsibility of passing on the knowledge, of protecting the tradition, of teaching the history and the values. But as generations pass, that memory will fade. There will be the passing on of stories about people that we didn't really know. And then one generation goes into the next and so forth and so on. And unless we are very, very special people, like Nehanda in Zimbabwe, or Ya Asantewa, or Anne Nzinga, then eventually we will be forgotten on a personal level. Now, Mbidi calls this, I had it up before, John S. Mbidi, He calls this the period of personal immortality. And he says that it lasts up to 5 generations. Now that's an arbitrary figure, okay? But he's picked that. And he said that once that time is over, no longer do you have personal immortality. And I want to ask you the question, what happens at that point? Does life for an African end at that point? And I'm not going to answer that now, but I want you to think about it. And we're going to come back to it. I promise you I'll come back to it. Now, another thing that happens in Ancestor Communion is that marriage takes on a very special significance. It becomes sacred more than in any other spiritual philosophy. The male and female couple must join in order to procreate. There is a value to having many children, which assures the continued existence of the parents and then of the group. And this was one of the reasons for polygyny, where you could have more children within a sanctioned marriage situation. Ancestor Communion only sanctions heterosexual relationships. Why? Because it is concerned with the continuance of the group. Okay? It's very clear what we're talking about. We're talking about a culture and its continuance. And that's what Ancestor Communion is all about. So if we live well, we have many children, many friends, and we treat them well, we are assured of personal immortality. The elders link us to our ancestors. The ancestors link us to the source. The elders are wiser than we are, and so they teach us. The ancestors are wiser than the elders, and so they teach them. And the elders, in turn, teach us. And that's the way it goes. This is a language of symbolism, a symbolic modality. How do the elders, in quotes, learn from the ancestors? They learn through ritual. They learn through spirit possession. They learn by becoming more and more spiritual, by their own growth and development. They learn through symbols. They learn through symbolic behavior. They must be in communication with the ancestors. They must have spiritual connectedness. We learn through the rituals of communion. And they teach through behavior and the telling of history. One of the very important rituals of communication is what we call libation. A very important ritual of Ancestor Communion. It is a sacred ritual act in which we commune with the ancestors. There is the pouring of liquid that we do for libation, and usually I begin this talk with libation, which I didn't do this time, so we certainly will have to do it at the end. There is also the setting aside of plates of food or portions of food for the ancestors, and this is done before a meal. Now, why is this done? These are the things, the acts, which are labeled by names like heathen, pagan, by non-African religions. So let's get right down to the very serious kinds of things that we have to talk about. Why are these acts labeled in this way, with terms that are derogatory? Well, we could say that others label these sacred acts in a derogatory manner because they don't understand the complex African system of symbols, that they don't understand the symbolic intent. But then I wonder about that. And the reason I wonder about that is because all religious behavior involves some symbolism. Whether you face east, or you eat wafers, or you drink wine, or even prayer itself.
That's right.
Prayer itself is a symbolic act.
That's right.
So why suddenly does symbolism escape us? And so then we label African practices in these derogatory manner. I think it has another reason. And I think that intuitively there is a fear of the spiritual, the cultural, and the political power that these rituals can have. That in us coming together and performing libation together, they know that there is power in that act. And so that if they can make us feel ashamed of that and that there's something wrong with it, then they are weakening us and cutting us off from a source of power. Libation is a sacred act which symbolically expresses meaning on several levels at once. It reflects a very sophisticated philosophical understanding of spiritual reality. It enables African people to relate to a multi-dimensional, rich, and complex universe. And I want to explain libation on 3 levels. On one level, this act of libation, the pouring of the liquid or setting aside of the food, makes a statement, and it says that the community is whole. The community is together, and therefore is strong, and that life is meaningful. If that's the case, then we need the presence of not only the physical community, but we need the presence of the spiritual community as well, if we are to be whole. And this is essential at mealtime. It is essential at mealtime so that we can have a feeling of spiritual security that the family is together, that the family is whole. And there used to be a time when we would feel that way about our family dinners and our meals.
That's right.
And our parents would want to make sure that everybody was there, because there was something special about that. We've lost a lot of that now. So we eat anywhere, in any way, with anyone.
That's right.
But the taking of a meal together had spiritual significance in the African mind, and still does. So that you didn't want to be able to say that somebody's missing. What you say is that everybody is there. The elders are served first, so the ancestors must be served first, because the ancestors are the elders of the family. And their presence is symbolized through libation. Okay, and there are many ways in which we continue that practice and don't even realize it. And when the brothers on the corner, well, before they drink, they will open a bottle, they will pour off something, and they'll say, that's for the brother who's not here. Am I correct? Okay, and we can talk more about that later. That is practicing ancestor communion, but not on a conscious level. They don't know where it comes from, but that's okay too. Remember that in the African worldview, spirit and matter are joined. We can express a spiritual concept through doing something which is physical. And that's what we're doing when we do that. We can express, feel, state, and affirm the spiritual presence of departed members of the family by sharing meal with them. Symbolically, we are keeping them alive. The second meaning of libation. The ancestors act on our behalf. They have increased spiritual power. They are closer to the source. So they can protect us, they can guide us, they can help us, they can bless us with fertility, with children, with prosperity, all because they are closer to the source of power, to the source of life. They are a vehicle through which we receive energy from the creative source. They energize us. But only if we honor them. And that is what libation is doing. By honoring them, we strengthen them. We are asking for strength, and so we give strength. What is the principle here? Reciprocity. The circle again. The ancestors also need us, because without the physically living, and this is an important point, without us, the physically living, their spirit cannot manifest. Their spirit cannot be manifested. There is an interdependent relationship between us and the ancestors. We need each other. When we have harvest, we give the first fruits to the ancestors. That still happens in the Caribbean. Okay? We thank them. The ancestors represent a spiritual part of ourselves with which we must remain in contact in order to be whole. The ancestors are us. To honor them is to honor the divine within us. That is our divine specificity. By that I mean our divine uniqueness, our divine genealogy, our divine history. All of these things, that is our particular history, our line, our bloodline, our nation, is responsible for the talents, gifts, and achievements of our people. That's what Ancestor Communion tells us. Libation is an act of thanksgiving. It is an act of honor and an act of respect. Now there's another level. I told you it was multidimensional, on which libation has significance. Libation is an act of communion. The community becomes one through spiritual joining. As we've said before, that's what communion means. Okay? The family becomes one by spiritual joining. The nation, our nation, becomes one by spiritual joining. We join with our ancestors, and in so doing, they become immortal through these acts of libation. They become immortal. And what happens to us? We become immortal. Without this, there is no immortality. There is no life without ancestral communion. There is no renewal. The circle is broken. Libation, like all ritual and other ceremonies of ancestor communion, symbolizes the link between the physically dead and the physically living. Symbolically, it states the connection between spirit and matter, between the sacred and the profane, or the sacred and the ordinary. This is very important because philosophically, we achieve immortality by transcending finite existence, physical existence, mortal existence. That's what it means to be immortal. We achieve immortality by transcending the boundaries which separate past, present, and future. Indeed, through the creation and awareness of sacred time, we do away with these lineal conceptions of past, present, and future. We are able to exist in sacred time, the eternal, timeless dimension, in which we have recreated life. That's what we can do as Africans. We recreate life through the mechanism and concept of rebirth. Rebirth is a powerful concept. European materialism cannot achieve this. Okay? Perhaps rebirth is the most important of African spiritual conceptions. In the eternal dimension, all being is joined and can therefore be energized by the universal life force or creative energy. Can you believe that all of this is being said, symbolized, stated symbolically when we pour libations, when we set aside a portion of food, which people want to tell us is some kind of strange act, heathen, and so forth. Okay? All right. The writer that I referred to before, I told you had some problems, Mbidi, he said that Africans had no future. Because what was happening was, he said that African conceptions are limited, and that what we needed was European conceptions to break out of that limitation. Okay?
I had that problem too.
Now, actually, the seeds of our future are planted within us by a sacred past. And what happens is that instead of a line being drawn, we get a circle with spiral dimensions. And so we carry within us all time. And the mistake that Mbidi made was, well, let me put it this way, I won't say the mistake that he made. He didn't understand this because in adopting a non-African religion, he was forced to use a non-African worldview. And he attempted to use that worldview to explain African concepts, which you can't do. Okay? Now let's return to this idea of memory. And remember, we were talking about personal immortality, and I asked you a question about it. And let's say, what happens to us? What happens to our spirit after 5, 6, or 7 generations, maybe a century or maybe 2 centuries we're talking about? That's a hard time to remember anything, right? A long time. So is this the end? I don't know if anybody had an answer for me, but I asked it a time before. Do you think that that's the end? Well, you know I'm going to say no, right? But then the question is why and how, how do we get out of that? Okay. There is a good term which Mbidi uses that he calls collective immortality. He says after this period we move into collective immortality. Let's see very quickly, what does that mean? We are no longer remembered by our specific name. There is nobody around anymore who remembers what we look like or what we did particularly in our lives, okay? That's long been gone. So what happens? Our existence changes. It takes a new form. It takes a new dimension. We no longer exist on a personal level. Our existence is no longer single. It is no longer unique. It is no longer limited to what we were as physical beings. It becomes something else. Our identity changes. It merges with the collective identity of the group, with the collective identity of the nation. the collective identity of the community and the culture. We become a part of a spiritual collectivity linked to cultural and racial origins, and which continues in the traditions and existence of a group's collective memory. It continues in the cultural origins of that group. I'm going to refer to something that James Small said. I like this. I don't know if you heard him speak at First World, but you need to hear this brother speak.
Yes.
Okay. Brother Javalani says yes.
Be here next month.
Okay, all right. So you better be here. Okay? He said, I feel the pain of my ancestors during the Middle Passage. That's what he's talking about now. He doesn't know a particular person who was in that Middle Passage necessarily, you understand? But being a part of that spiritually, he feels that pain. So that's his memory. That's his collective spiritual memory that allows him to do that. We share in the courage of Harriet Tubman because she was our ancestor. That's what this concept means. It's a powerful concept. It has serious implications also. That is, it puts a heavy weight on us. We got to remember that. We have a heavy responsibility. Our collective ancestors live only as long as we have a national, racial consciousness. Can you hear what I'm saying? Only as long as we identify with them do they live. So we have the power of either killing them or making them live by what we do. Only as long as we remember who we are and where we came from, who we're connected to, will they live. Do you hear what I'm saying? And that is why such pains have been taken by Europeans and the proselytizers of non-African religions to make us forget who we are or make us ashamed of being who we are or make us associate our ancestors with evil. And that's what we've done. That's what we've done. There are many statements which we make that really are saying that. They're saying our ancestors were involved in some evil things and that we are involved in evil things when we do as they did. To forget in this concept is to terminate. To praise someone else's ancestors is to strengthen their ancestors and to strengthen them. Now their ancestors cannot strengthen us. That's what this concept says. Okay? And what we do when we do that is that we cut ourselves off from a source of strength. Our only source of strength, because it's our link to the creative source, to creative energy, to the source of life. We cut ourselves off from life-giving forces when we forget our ancestors. And thereby, we deny ourselves immortality. There is no cultural existence, no spiritual strength, no immortality for us except as a whole, as one, and as a community. Only by recognizing ourselves as a community, as a nation of people, as one, can we gain these things. We cannot gain them as in quotes, individuals. That's what this concept says. Individuals divorced from cultural, historical origins.
I hear Jesus.
We can only attain them as a community, as a collective, as a nation, and as a people. And that is what the concept of Ancestor Communion means. That's what it states. I'm going to say some very hard things, okay?
Say it.
Now, Jesus is reputed to have said, "No one comes to my Father but through me." The African says, "No one gains eternal life but through her own ancestors." Think about that. Now let's get back to the life cycle. You said that the elders, you told me this, you said the elders die, then they're reborn as ancestral spirits. Okay? So there's that movement towards the source. But what I want to know is that the last stage? What happens after that? I don't know. Well, what you need to do is always remember the circle. I gave it, right? That's what I told you. That's right. I told you that, rebirth. And the brother remembered that's very important. How do we achieve the eternal cycle of life? And why do we include the yet unborn in the community? Nobody asked that. You know, I said the yet unborn, they were in there too. How did they get there? They're not here yet. Remember that it's not a lineal conception. Remember that each stage is death and rebirth. This is what happens. The ancestors contribute part of their spirit to the new members of the group. Each ancestor is hooked up with a new member that is born into the group. That is what this very deep philosophical concept says. Their continued spiritual existence is therefore manifested in the new babies which are born to us. That is an African conception. Spirit in this way is regenerated. You see that? Life goes and comes around. We say that all the time. The cycle continues by starting over again. We don't look forward to a heavenly existence. We look forward to life on earth in the future of our nation. Do you see that? We look forward to life on earth in the children that are born to our nation. So the future is in the past. And you have the completion of the circle. Now, I'm not talking about reincarnation. I think it's a mistake to call that reincarnation. A lot of people do that. They use that term, and I like to be more specific when I use terms. Because we're not talking about karma. We're not talking about a concept where you live another life because you haven't learned the lesson that you were supposed to learn in the life before. And that you keep living these lives because you keep having things to learn. It's not that concept. I'm not putting that conception down. I'm merely saying that is not what this conception is. Okay? This belief in the rebirth of the ancestral spirits it symbolizes the oneness of spirit. That's what it's really stating in one way. It is a kind of recycling, so to speak. The ancestor is not duplicated. That's why it's not reincarnation. The ancestor merely shares a spirit with a new member. The ancestor is physically connected to the living group through this new baby. Okay? All right. So that the ancestral spirit makes a contribution to the to the future of the group. We could say it like that. And in this way can manifest her or his spiritual existence. I also wanted to give you some examples from the Yoruba, from the Akan, from the Fon people, of how this actually works out. Give you some terms. And I think, again, I'll wait until the end. And if people are particularly interested, then I'll do that. But I think it's very important for us to see how this really concretely works out among groups of African people and speak about it with African linguistic terms. Now, another thing that this concept does is that children take on great emphasis, great priority in African culture because of this concept. Children are understood as having come to us from the spirit world. And they bring knowledge with them. We learn from them so that we can guide them. What they are actually learning from us is simply how to relate their spirituality to an earthly existence. That's what we're teaching them. Okay? Children in this conception are sacred. They are wise. They are ancestral spirits reborn. Therefore, they carry within them our racial history. They carry within them our spiritual history. They are new, and yet they are old. They are not born in ignorance. Neither are they born in sin. We as African human beings are sacred precisely because we are African. That's what this belief says to us. The philosophy of Ancestor Communion tells us this. Now, let's look at a particular period in our history. What about us, those of us who are in the diaspora, got kind of cut off from all of this? How have we used Ancestor Communion? How has it given us strength? There's a term that I like to use that you might want to think about. Maafa, which is a Kiswahili term. And I've taken it to mean our Holocaust, our period of slavery. But I don't want to use the term Holocaust. I want to use our term. And so Maafa, which means great disaster, I refer to as this period in which people attempted to enslave us. Now, in this slave order, during this Maafa, this order for the European meant chaos for us. It meant chaos to our spirits. In the system of slavery, we were defined as machines, not as human beings. And this implied a spiritual death. Yet, we are here. What does that imply? It implies that there was a will to survive, a will to live. That there was an amazing ability to remain human in dehumanizing circumstances. The survival of our spirits required a spiritualistic worldview. Obviously, the European worldview was not spiritualistic. So we had to get that from somewhere. Yet what they were attempting to do was to cut us off from our source of strength. by denying the African worldview. That's why they told us all of these things were bad and backward and ignorant and so forth. But we had to create something different. We needed to be energized. And what did we do? We recreated the rituals which allowed us to commune with our ancestors. We recreated the rituals which allowed us to be reborn. To recreate ourselves, in fact. That's what we needed to do. We reached into our collective unconscious and remembered our ancestral selves. This is the process that brought us through this period and continues. We were therefore able to be energized as we Africanized Babylon, so to speak, or New Europe, or the New World, as some call it, and so forth. Okay? We expressed our creativity in the hush harbors, in the night sings, in the field hollers, in the sorrow songs. In all of these rituals, we became possessed by the spirits of our ancestors. To the extent that we could perceive ourselves as a community, we resisted. To the extent that we believed we were human, cultural beings, tied to a specific cultural tradition, a specific ancestral past, we persisted. In ritual, we danced, and we became the ancestors, joining with them and thereby transcending the limiting boundaries of ordinary reality, transcending the ma'afa, transcending the slave order. And we were able to enter into the rhythm of the universe and become part of a sacred cosmos. That is what it means to be immortal on a metaphysical level. The ancestors give us spirit. We give them physical existence. We have reciprocity and interdependence. During this period, we completed the circle and thereby were able to be energized. Dreams, for us, have always been a source of information. Always, we believe this. Information from our ancestral teachers. In dreams, there is a different logic. In dreams, there is a new time and a new space. Africans have known this for thousands of years. This was not discovered by Freud or Jung. Okay? The significance of dreams. Dreams are a doorway to our collective wisdom. And Dr. Richard King, whom you need to go and hear, I think it's on October 24th, is it? At First World, 145th Street for everybody. Says that our ancestral heritage is a biological record which allows us to tap the knowledge of our ancestral civilizations. All life, he says, is rooted in blackness. Our genes connect us to a vast storehouse of knowledge and wisdom, and he talks about the concept of a race memory, of the collective unconscious. And he says that our past is centuries into the future. Now, through Ancestor Communion, then, we are able to connect ourselves to the biological basis of African consciousness and to the spiritual basis of African wisdom. The African concept of Ancestor Communion implies a love of the communal self as the repository and expression of divine principle. And what I want to do is just summarize some characteristics of Ancestor Communion to show what it does for us, and I'll be close to the end. Spiritually, Ancestor Communion allows us to transcend meaninglessness, to transcend profane existence by connecting to a sacred reality, to experience ourselves as eternal beings. Ancestor Communion imparts emotional and psychological security and the experience of harmony, enabling us to deal with the specter of finite, isolated, individual existence, placing physical death in the context of eternal cycle of communal rebirth. Ancestor Communion gives spiritual meaning to physical reality. It tells us that Africa is our spiritual home. Asante in Afrocentricity says that Africa is a sacred magnetic symbol, which is a wonderful image. It just pulls us and gives us weight and gives us a foundation. Morally, Ancestor Communion tells us how we are bound to behave. We are bound to behave in such a way that the community will benefit. We are bound to behave in such a way that we will bring honor to our parents, to our family, and to our elders, and to our ancestors. We must imitate the ancestors as paragons of virtue and present models to our children so that we ourselves will become ancestors. I had a student which told me that a Yoruba priest, a Babalao, said, "We give birth to our children so that they will give birth to us," which I think is a beautiful statement. Culturally, Ancestor Communion emphasizes values, traditions, perspectives, aesthetics, images, symbols, customs, forms of expression which we share and which we have created collectively as a people, which we have created out of a unique ancestral heritage and historical experience. Socially, Ancestor Communion binds the group for cooperative enterprise and mutual support of those who share common descent. It sanctions the social order. Then finally, politically, Ancestor Communion is Pan-Africanist, it is African nationalist, it is group-oriented, it creates a collective consciousness for the determination of common goals, common destiny, a common purpose, and allows us, therefore, it can become a basis for the determination of common strategies for changing the present order. Ancestor Communion becomes a basis for dynamism, that is, for activism, rather than conservatism, when placed in the context of the present circumstances of the oppression of our people. Ancestor Communion mandates that we revolutionize the order to become victors as opposed to victims. Ancestor Communion celebrates our own people, and therefore it tells you politically what side you must be on. It tells us that Africa is the center of our being, the center of the world, and it raises the symbol of Africa to the level of the sacred. Now, what I'd like to end with is to get very practical and say, for those who are interested, I just want to list some ways that we could practice Ancestor Communion, okay? Because we have to be creative, because everything's not intact for us, and we know the reasons why it isn't. So we have to recreate. For one thing, the naming of our children can involve us in Ancestor Communion, and we do a lot of that already, right? The naming of our institutions. For instance, I was thinking just yesterday, the significance of having the Nyerere Education Institute. That spirit of a great African political leader lives because we have given one of our institutions his name, lives in a very important way and will continue to live as long as the institution lives. And what that says to us is that we have to keep that institution alive. Okay? Another concept, which I didn't get to talking about, is that of an ancestral guardian soul. Among all African people, the Yoruba, for instance, each child is thought to have an ancestral guardian soul. You will have a special name because of that, and it is thought that guardian soul protects you and has a special relationship to you. Libation, daily libation, the pouring of libation, where we call the names of our ancestors, our collective ancestors, our ancient ancestors, our diasporic ancestors, and our family ancestors. Then we will have ceremonies of thanksgiving for the ancestors. Another way in which we practice Ancestor Communion is through our values, through the way that we live, by sacralizing those values and internalizing those values. Another way is by having the setting up of ancestral shrines, where we have a sacred place in our home, where we can make offerings to an ancestral spirit, and maybe pictures of those who we don't want to forget. Most of us have these pictures around us anyway. We merely say that this is sacred to us. We have to have ceremonies in praise of national ancestors. Recently, we had a ceremony for Coltrane's birthday. We had a ceremony in honor of Steve Biko, very important, our slain Azanian leader. Ceremonies for Garvey, and to bring forth the spirit, the powerful spirit of Garvey, and for Malcolm, and so forth. Another way we practice Ancestor Communion is by keeping our family traditions, by having family reunions, which a lot of people are doing now, keeping records of the family, making sure we have pictures, and discussing these things with our children. Our children have got to know their families, their roots, their specific roots. Okay, they can't be strangers to that, or they are going to feel that you robbed them of something when they grow up. We can perhaps have monthly meetings with other families and other groups that are sharing the perspective that we are moving into or that we have, where we honor the ancestors and commune with them through ritual, dance, music, song, poetry. Nothing weird, just the things that we like to do. Another way that we practice Ancestor Communion is by having children. That's sacred. Okay? As long as we are prepared African human beings. We said that, right? Another way is through the importance of history. There we gain collective immortality. We learn our history, we study our history, and we know our history, and we teach our history. We talk to the ordinary elders in our community to learn our history. It is very important that we learn lessons from our history. We say we study our history, we know our history, but do we learn the lessons that the history teaches? That's very important. And this becomes a method for the reascension of Africa. And we give to our children a reverence for studying, for remembering. We also must learn our culture through special mechanisms that we call rites of passage. We should organize initiation rites, puberty rites for our children. Every child of African descent should go through a period of instruction in a group situation where they are learning their responsibility to the community, where they are learning who they are, and this is going to help them to become the adults that we need them to be. And it's going to also hopefully give them the strength that they need in this society that we have around us to say no to the things that are out there. We can't blame them when they don't do that if we haven't put this kind of energy into teaching them. And we can do that through our rites of passage. For those of us who are more mystical, who want to develop our intuition and our ability to communicate with the ancestors, we can be involved or in tune with our dreams, with our feelings, the feelings that we get sometimes when we think we're being protected, when we think we're being warned about something that's about to happen. A lot of different stories probably each of us could tell if we, we're honest, right? Okay. Also, we can wear things that belong to departed members who were close to us and sacred to us, and we can pass those things on, and those become treasured by our children. I could go on, and we could go on, collectively trying to create ways that we could practice Ancestor Communion, but I'm going to end with this one. And it's not really an ending, but I see it as a beginning. We can practice Ancestor Communion by organizing politically for the self-determination of all African people. We can practice Ancestor Communion by saying that the priority is our people, by saying race first, as Marcus Garvey did. And we must realize that if we do not do this, our ancestral spirits will weaken and we will die as a people. So let's begin. Thank you.
Warm African welcome. Beautiful presentation. Beautiful. All right, we're going to take about a 10-minute break, and we're going to come back for questions and answers. So feel free to move around for about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Symbolism involved, and I'll just keep it simple, is that at any gathering where we would come together, what we want is for the presence of the ancestral spirits to be with us. So that what we're doing can have their blessing, and so that we can feel whole and secure. Now, there are other times when we need the presence of the ancestral spirits because some kind of judgment is going to go down, or, so then they sometimes are ritually, they come among us. That is through dances with masks and so forth, like Egungun, among the Yoruba. But when we come together and at all meals, there's some kind of libation which you can perform. All you do is have the family come together, and usually the eldest in the family would pour some liquid, and there are various kinds of things that can be said in honor of the ancestors. Now, in the book Afrocentricity, Malefi Asante has two statements of libation, which I use in my home, with my daughter. And one is, what he does is to also use the symbolism of our experience here. He uses the red, black, and green vases. And as you say one, you take from the red and pour into the black, and as you say, the next one you take from the green and pour into the black, so that he has been creative, and that's part of what he calls Njia. The way means the way. But at any rate, this is, and the sisters should help me, also the daughters of Africa who are here. We call upon the spirit of our ancestors far and near, father of our fathers, mother of our mothers, to render mercy, to bear witness to the liberation and victory of our people forever. It is done. So it's simple, and you can do your own. Okay? Like maybe, on birthdays or when you have a special need to commune. Okay? Or, if we're coming together for a Kwanzaa celebration, you have children that you have to make sure you're teaching all the time. You have a feast. You don't eat until there's something that is put aside for the ancestors, until libation is done. That's all the preparation that there has to be. Okay? Yes.
First, I'd like to begin by complimenting the sister on her magnificent presentation.
Thank you.
And giving you thanks. I have a statement and a question. The statement is that I gather, and something that came to my mind, was that you were confirming the notion that has been stated also in various religious books as well as tradition from other groups, is that interracial unions are therefore anti-spiritual and contributes to the break-in of a people's life force.
That's a very interesting statement.
That really hit me, though.
And it really hits me, and you say, I think it's very well said, and I think that the concept that I have explained would definitely speak to that. I haven't found that in when you say other groups, I know what you're talking about, okay. Other groups who are trying to keep their heritage strong and their line strong, precisely. That makes for strength. Anything else makes for a weakening. Yes, I would have to agree with that.
Okay, and the question was, what happens to the spirit of a child when it dies, for example? Does it catch up and mature to an elder in the life after death cycle?
Very good question. Because what I have described is the normal, or the natural, I should say natural life cycle. And so for the African, what you want is for it to go through all the natural stages of existence. And that's what you call a life really well lived and so forth. And so when there is an unnatural death or a death that happens early, that is considered to be a break in the harmony. It's to indicate, that something is wrong, so there has to be an explanation. Now, among the Yoruba, they have a name for that. Specifically with a child. When a child dies, they call it, the spirit is Akibu. Akibu. And as I've said, the children come to us from the spirit world. And what they believe is that the spirit world is a good place, and they're happy. Again, remember, this is symbolically spoken or poetically expressed. And therefore, there's a kind of ambivalence that takes place at the birth of a child. That is, that spirit is also still connected with the spirit world. And so you have to perform, a ritual to kind of say, well, look, you're here now among us, and this is where you need to stay. Because there is also a tendency for that spirit to want to remain in the spirit world. And what they believe is that an Akibu is a spirit that is born but doesn't want to remain with us, but wants to return. to the spirit world, so that if a sister, for instance, continues to have well, either miscarriages or giving birth to a child and the child, dying early, it's that same spirit is continually being born, but that spirit wants to remain, in the spirit world, and so dies physically. And so, as with anything in African culture, you have to perform special ritual to make sure that it's not that spirit that will be born next time. So they go to great pains. You're involved with the priest and the priestess and so forth to make sure that there is a birth that will stay here. Okay? That's one part of your answer. Another part is when someone dies early or without having gone through the other stages, and that can be later, it doesn't have to be a child. It is believed that the spirit may not, or the soul may not be at rest, that it's like they went before their time. And what happens is that it will wander, the spirit will wander, and may go among other people who don't recognize who, or what that spirit is. And at some point, that being will also pass, okay, physically, will die, we could say. But it will happen at the time when it should have happened. Do you see? There is, Africans believe in that if transitions don't happen correctly, that there is an unrest, in the spirit, that we must somehow bring things to a closure, to a harmonious closure, so that even with someone who does live the full cycle, suppose a funeral ritual isn't correctly carried out, or something happens that's wrong, then that spirit can be at rest and go around and be among us, but be, not in a comforting kind of way. And so we need to do something to understand that and to make that be right. Any more question about that? Now, I was particularly interested in the sister, if these are difficult things, to explain, because what we're talking about is the exception. But it's important because in the African conception, it's very serious about, how how you've lived, how long you've been able to,